In 1953, a 27-year-old man went into surgery to fix a problem with seizures that were ruining his life. He came out of that operating room and never aged again. Not physically, mentally, for the rest of his life. Whenever he looked in a mirror, he expected to see the face of a 27-year-old. He never understood why an old man kept staring back. Doctors studied him for the next 5 decades trying to understand what exactly had happened inside his brain that day. What they found inside his case changed how every textbook on Earth defines memory. His name was Henry Molaison. For decades, the scientific world knew him only by his initials, H.M. Before the surgery, Henry's life had been defined by suffering nobody else could see. Since childhood, he'd suffered from severe epilepsy. Seizures struck him constantly, sometimes multiple times a day. By his 20s, they had become so severe that medication couldn't control them anymore. He couldn't hold a job, he couldn't drive, he could barely function. So in 1953, a surgeon named William Scoville made a decision that would echo through neuroscience for the next 70 years. He proposed removing a small structure deep inside Henry's brain called the hippocampus. At the time, almost nobody understood what the hippocampus actually did. It was considered, essentially, expendable tissue. Scoville removed it, both sides completely. The seizure stopped almost entirely. But something else stopped too. When Henry woke up from that surgery, he could still talk. He could still walk. His personality was intact. His intelligence was intact. But he could not form a single new memory. Not one. Here's what that actually meant in practice. If you walked into Henry's hospital room and introduced yourself, talked with him for 20 minutes, then left and came back 5 minutes later, he would have no idea you had ever met. Every conversation was the first conversation. Every meal was the first meal. He read the same magazine over and over for years, and each time it was completely new to him. His mother passed away years after the surgery. Each time someone told him, he experienced the grief for the first time. Fresh, unprocessed, as raw as the moment he first heard it. Then, minutes later, he forgot it had happened at all. This wasn't memory loss in the way we typically think of it. Henry could still remember his childhood. He could remember his life right up until the surgery. What he had lost was the ability to take a new experience and lock it into long-term storage. Scientists call this anterograde amnesia. And until Henry, nobody understood that this kind of memory and the memory of your distant past were two entirely separate systems, run by entirely different parts of the brain. In 1957, a young researcher named Brenda Milner began studying Henry, and she would continue studying him for the next 4 decades. What she discovered inside his condition became some of the most cited findings in the history of psychology. The first major discovery came almost by accident. Milner asked Henry to trace a star shape while looking only at his hand's reflection in a mirror, a notoriously difficult task that requires the brain to learn an unfamiliar coordination pattern. Henry practiced this task day after day. Each day, when Milner brought out the task, Henry insisted he had never seen it before. He had no memory of practicing it. But here's what astonished her. Every single day, his performance improved. His hands knew something, his mind didn't. He was learning. He simply had no awareness that he was learning, and no memory that the learning had ever happened. This single experiment proved something nobody had ever demonstrated before. There isn't one kind of memory. There are several running on entirely separate systems. Conscious memory, the kind where you can describe what happened, lived inside the hippocampus Henry had lost. But procedural memory, the kind your body builds through repetition, like riding a bike or playing an instrument, lived somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the surgery hadn't touched. Henry's body was quietly building skills his mind would never know it possessed. But here is the part almost nobody talks about. The most unsettling discoveries about Henry weren't about what he'd lost. They were about what remained, for over a decade after his mother's death. Researchers noted something strange. When asked how he felt about life, Henry would often describe a vague, persistent unease he couldn't explain. Like something was wrong, but he had no idea what. His conscious mind had no memory of his mother dying, but something in him still seemed to register the loss. Researchers began to suspect that emotional memory and factual memory might also run on separate systems. that you could feel the shape of grief long after the specific memory causing it had vanished entirely. Henry could lose the story of his mother's death completely, but some part of him still carried the weight of it. This raised a question neuroscience still hasn't fully answered. If you can feel grief without remembering why, what part of you is actually doing the grieving? In 1992, MIT researcher Suzanne Corkin took over as Henry's primary researcher and continued studying him until his death in 2008. Over those years, something remarkable happened that nobody had predicted. Henry, despite being unable to form new explicit memories, gradually began to recognize Corkin's face as familiar. Even though he couldn't say why or explain who she was. He couldn't tell you her name most days. But he would smile when she walked in. The way you smile at someone whose presence simply feels right. Even when you can't say why. Some residue of familiarity was getting through, even without the conscious memory required to explain it. It suggested that somewhere beneath conscious memory, there was a slower, quieter system tracking the emotional weight of repeated experience. One Henry's surgery hadn't fully erased. He was, in some small way, still learning who mattered to him. He simply could never tell you why. Henry died in 2008 at the age of 82, having spent 55 years unable to remember a single day of his own life after the age of 27. When researchers later examined his brain in detail, something further surprised them. The damage was more extensive and more complicated than the original surgical notes had described. Parts of the surrounding tissue had also been affected, which meant the very foundation of half a century of neuroscience textbooks had been built on an incomplete map of what had actually happened inside Henry's skull. Even in death, Henry was still teaching scientists things nobody had known. His brain is now preserved as 2,401 individual digital slices, freely available for researchers around the world to study forever. In a strange way, Henry achieved something close to permanence. The man who could never remember anything became one of the most permanently studied human beings in history. Every memory you've ever made exists, because a tiny structure deep inside your brain decided it was worth keeping. You don't get to choose which moments it saves. It happens automatically, silently, every single day, without you ever noticing the machinery at work. Henry lost that machinery completely, and in losing it, he showed the rest of us exactly how much it was doing the entire time. Every person you've ever fallen in love with, every skill you've ever built, every joke you remember well enough to tell again, all of it depends on a structure the size of your thumb, quietly filing away your life while you live it, asking for nothing in return, except that you never think about it at all. You are not the same person you were yesterday. You are the same person, plus everything your hippocampus decided was worth keeping. Henry never got to find out who he could have become. You still do.